مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. قبل 20 عاما وخلال أيام من الهجوم على برجي مركز التجارة العالمي، دخلت القوات الخاصة الأميركية أفغانستان لتبدأ المعركة ضد القاعدة وحركة طالبان الرائعة لها. تحقق لهم النصر. تم القضاء على القاعدة إلى حد كبير، وفار معظم أفراد حركة طالبان إلى باكستان، وولدت أفغانستان جديدة. وبعد 20 عاما انعكس مسار هذه القصة. هذه المرة فار الأميركيون من أفغانستان وعادت طالبان، ربما مع القاعدة، وولدت أفغانستان القديمة مرة أخرى. كيف حدث هذا الأمر؟ كيف بعد 20 عاما أجبر طالبان أمريكا الرحيل عن أفغانستان بالطريقة نفسها التي أجبر المجاهدون بها الروس الرحيل قبل جيل مدى؟ وماذا يعني هذا التغيير المفاجئ بالنسبة للمصالح الأمريكية في الشرق الأوسط؟ لمناقشة انهيار الجيش الأفغاني والحكومة الأفغانية والانسحاب الأمريكي ونجاح طالبان، يسرني أن أرحب باثنين من أذكى خبراء السياسة الخارجية في واشنطن، وهما دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. The images out of Kabul have been frightening. We've seen people running for their lives, hoping to grab on to that last airplane leaving Kabul airport. How did this collapse happen? What was the American role? What does it all mean for America's presence in what we used to call the broader Middle East? To discuss these issues, I am delighted to welcome our panel of foreign policy experts, Deniss Ross and Juan Zarate. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me this morning. Afghanistan, a story of collapse. Briefly, how did this happen? How did it happen so fast? Deniss?
Well, I think, regrettably, notwithstanding close to $100 billion of investment in the Afghan security forces, 20 years of involvement, the one thing we never succeeded in doing was rooting out the kind of endemic corruption. The fact that there was never a wide logistic system where Afghan military could always be assured of resupply. There was, because of the corruption and the skimming, there was Afghan forces rarely being paid, feeling isolated, disconnected from a central government. A lot of localized rules, Taliban being much smarter in terms of being able to connect with a lot of the localized rule, and us obviously not reading the situation very well and not fully appreciating the hollowness of the forces, not necessarily that they had no capability to fight, but that the capacity to undercut their will to fight was as great as it was. So I think what we see is kind of intelligence failure on our part, a lack of awareness of just how quickly these forces could collapse. The obvious state of that reality is that the president just a few weeks ago could say we wouldn't see anything like the scenes we're now seeing, saying we wouldn't see anything like what we saw with the fall of Saigon in 1975. So it tells you that we simply weren't aware ultimately of the lack of will, the fundamental weakness, the hollowness of the forces.
Juan, how do you see it?
Well, I think this is a failure, not just of the last few days or few weeks, but the last few years. And I think the decision to precipitously take out not just American forces, but NATO support really did reveal a hollowed force in Afghanistan, as Deniss just described. What I think is so shocking, though, is how poorly planned and executed this all was. The ability to pull out, for example, those interpreters and those that had supported U.S. and contractor activities over time, the ability to accelerate visas, the thought going around how to deal with U.S. investments, for example, in Bagram or Kandahar air bases, which were significant bases. Just the lack of forethought as to what a U.S. pullout would actually mean, regardless of whether or not the Taliban would advance as quickly as they did, is just shocking. And I think the one thing, Rob, that baffles me and perhaps Dennis as well, having served in these positions, is sort of the inability to have a frank and honest policy discussion about what our interests were in Afghanistan in 2021, as opposed to simply reacting to why we were there in 2001. That is to say, we may have done things wrong. There may have been other reasons to be in Afghanistan, but there were reasons perhaps to maintain a small footprint in Afghanistan, to support the army, to fight the Taliban and al-Qaeda remnants, to maintain bases that are important not just for Afghanistan, but for U.S. posture in the region, Iran, China, etc. So the lack of forethought around what the pullout would mean and what this means for our interests moving forward is also a shocking part of this debate.
All right, so let's take a moment to step back and go back in time. Juan, you were there at the beginning, back in the Bush administration. What was the goal, and how did it evolve in your era from that original decision to send U.S. forces into Afghanistan?
Rob, the decision to go into Afghanistan was fairly swift and straightforward to begin with, which was to go after the elements of al-Qaeda that had used Afghanistan and Western Pakistan as a base to plan and launch 9/11, and frankly, to have built up their capabilities over time. The point of that was not only just to punish those who had planned 9/11, but also to prevent future attacks, to not allow al-Qaeda or allied terrorist movements to attack U.S. interests in the future. So that was the purpose. It was to go after al-Qaeda, to dismantle the terrorist network, obviously to find and kill bin Laden if necessary, and obviously in that regard to topple the Taliban government, which was allowing safe haven for al-Qaeda. That was the initial purpose. I think what evolved over time was a desire to help the Afghan government establish a government that was more open, more pluralistic, that could defend itself. And that starts to then look like the nation building that so many Americans have not liked, which has involved investment of billions of dollars, not just in the military and intelligence services, but in the economy and the other aspects of Afghan society. But Rob, I'll tell you, I remember my first trip into Afghanistan after our invasion, which was early 2002, and the country was still at war. But it was clear that we were there not just to deal with bin Laden, but also to rectify some of the ills of the Taliban government. We went to a UN camp that was starting to teach girls and have classes for young girls that now had the hope and aspiration of doing something with their lives. So this quickly became it was a counterterrorism mission to begin with, but it quickly became much more than that as we got on the ground.
So that much more than that aspect, Dennis, by the time you were in the White House, in the Obama administration, there were already, calls America should be coming out, should be leaving. This was, the mission had expanded too far. And President Obama had a strategy of surge and then withdrawal. What was the goal of that, and was that successful?
It's interesting to put that in context, Rob. You may recall that when President Obama was running for the presidency, he drew a distinction between the war in Iraq, which he saw as a war of choice, and he viewed it as a disastrous choice, versus Afghanistan, which he described really as a war of necessity. It was the good war. Iraq was the bad war. Afghanistan was the good war. That was a war that was forced upon us. The issue of the surge was the result of a strategy debate during the course of 2009, during which, by the way, then Vice President Biden argued strongly against what was this wider mission, which was, if not called nation building, it was somehow seen in broader terms that we could help continue the transformation of Afghanistan. The end of the enslavement of women, the women having rights, the creation of at least a quasi-democracy. There was a sense that we could succeed in this, but President Obama basically said, look, I don't know if we can get there or not, but he established an approach in which he said, we will search for 1 year. If those who make the argument that we can succeed in this broader objective, they will know, we will see that within the course of 1 year that we have been successful. If it turns out within the course of 1 year we haven't, then it's clear it's not going to work at all. So that's why he said we're going to search for 1 year, and at the end of 1 year, we'll begin a process of withdrawal. The truth is, I think we became less focused on the broader objective, meaning what are we really trying to produce in Afghanistan? Is this purely a counter-terror mission? Is this a mission related to broader strategic interests? Because once we're in there, the consequence of getting out and maybe the Taliban coming back is so severe, we really can't tolerate that. There wasn't, in my mind, a real clarity of objective. There was, in a sense, a kind of replacement of a tactical set of objectives, meaning we will see if we can bolster the Afghans to the point where they can do this on their own, and that will really be our purpose, and we're surging so that at some point we can actually get out. In other words, our means determined what the objectives were as opposed to the objective determining what the means were.
And that was already 10 years ago.
That's correct.
We've gone another decade of on again, off again commitment to Afghanistan. How would you summarize, Juan, just the last decade? I know that's a difficult question to ask, but it's been 10 years since we did a surge and then a withdrawal, and we're still in Afghanistan. How would you characterize the last decade of American involvement?
I think that the simple way of describing it is lurching toward withdrawal. I think you've had not just the Obama administration, but clearly the Trump administration, and now obviously President Biden, trying to get out of Afghanistan one way or the other. And you had President Trump very much forcefully wanting to get out. And his national security advisor, H.R. McMaster at the time, I think convinced him that that wasn't a wise move. He announced an Afghan strategy that he admitted openly and publicly in his speech was not his first instinct, which was to continue with a presence on the ground in Afghanistan. But it did suggest, especially as President Trump pushed for negotiations with the Taliban through his special envoy, Zal Khalilzad, the desire was to get out and to find a way out. And I think that's what could be defined as our principal mission over the last at least 5-6 years, which was lurch toward the exits. And I think that what we're seeing is sort of the results of it. And the Taliban knew this. The Taliban was prepared. They were preparing and using talks, I think, cleverly to pre-position, to distract, and obviously to prepare for the moment when they could take advantage of weakness, which we've seen over the last few days.
Lurching to withdrawal. Well, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about the implications of the withdrawal and what it means for broader American foreign policy from China to the Middle East and around the world in just a moment. Afghanistan is the top news story, occupying our thoughts, our minds, our hearts. So this week, let's take a look at some of the great film and literature on the graveyard of empires. In literature, the must-read on Afghanistan is Khalid Hossein's award-winning The Kite Runner, a searing story of love, loss, friendship, and responsibility in wartime Afghanistan. The 2003 novel was made into a beautiful and moving 2007 film, but I prefer the original written word. If you take your history visually, then I recommend the 2018 film 12 Strong, the story of the first group of American special operators who, even on horseback, won the fight against the medieval rulers of Taliban-governed Afghanistan in 2001. It's not for the faint of heart, but it is a riveting action film rooted in real history. But perhaps Afghanistan is summed up best in poetry, with Rudyard Kipling's famous lines. When you're wounded and left on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come out to cut up what remains, just roll to your rifle and blow out your brains and go to your God like a soldier. All right, so gentlemen, before we go to the global implications of what's going on in Afghanistan, I do want to ask you one question. The debate about, in your view, what, if anything, we owe the Afghans. President Biden recently said, quote, "We aren't and can't be responsible for things like girls' education or the future of Afghan democracy." Others take a different view, given the American commitment over the last 2 decades. What's your view about what we as Americans, if anything, owe the Afghan people? Juan, I'll start with you.
Well, Rob, I think we have a moral obligation to our allies and societies that we've partnered with and to a certain extent promise things to. And I think it doesn't mean we have to be in all places at all times or have to be either the world's policeman or the world's social worker. But it does mean that when we've worked with societies and countries to develop pluralistic societies, open societies, societies like Afghanistan that have had open media, that have opened education to women, where we've opened an American university, there is an obligation to defend those principles and to support those societies. Doesn't mean we have to have troops on the ground, but it does mean that we've got to find ways to both defend and promote those interests. And I think our precipitous withdrawal of troops has left not just the Afghan army sort of naked in the face of a Taliban assault, but it's left Afghan society now susceptible to the whims of what is a medieval terrorist organization. And that after 20 years of trying to create an open society, supporting women and girls in education, a pluralistic society, to me is just not acceptable.
Dennis, how would you answer that question?
I guess I would draw a distinction between what we might owe to the Afghan society, which I think is something we can debate, and how we withdrew obviously has implications for it, and what we owe to all those in Afghanistan who, in a sense, depended on us. I'm not just talking about the interpreters. I'm not just talking about those who might have been connected logistically to us in terms of supporting what we were doing militarily, or supporting the American presence that was there that wasn't security related. Every Afghan who in any way had a connection to us, we have a moral obligation. We have a moral obligation to safeguard them. Our whole approach, if we were going to get out, and I like Juan's description of lurching to withdrawal, if we knew we were going to get out, then we had an obligation to figure out a way to implement that withdrawal so that anyone who in any way was connected to us, we were in a position to get them out. If that meant it took more time for us to withdraw, so be it. If that meant we had to ensure we had access throughout the whole country, not only in Kabul, we had to structure a withdrawal plan. We had to be able to implement it. We had to plan on the basis of the worst case happening to ensure our ability to safeguard all of those people. That's not the same as safeguarding the Afghan society. It means anyone who signs up or connects with the United States, we don't forget the obligation we have to them. And here I would say, knowing what's going to happen, that's the worst part for me. Some of what we're seeing now, honestly, I feel is unconscionable.
Well, gentlemen, we're meeting just in the immediate aftermath of what's going on in Kabul. This story is not going away, and we'll be talking about the reverberations of this seismic event for quite some time. I want to thank you very much for your thoughtful and insightful remarks as this scene unfolds. Juan Zarate, Dennis Ross, thank you for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. The first election I really remember was 1972, when Richard Nixon trounced George McGovern. Nixon, a Republican, wanted out of the Vietnam War almost as much as McGovern, and in an eerie foreshadowing of decisions taken by presidents decades later, he thought that increasing the bombing and attacks on the enemy, what we would eventually call a surge, might force a peace agreement on acceptable terms. Within a year of his re-election, America was out of Vietnam. 2 years later, Nixon was out of the White House. And within 3 years, our allies South Vietnam fell to communist North Vietnam, with images seared into the memories of an entire generation of terrified people climbing a ramp to escape Saigon on the last helicopter to leave from the embassy roof. Never again, we vowed. Well, it happened again. When we went into Afghanistan in the days after the September 11th attack, it was a moment of national revenge and national triumph. This was the good war, the war of necessity, compared to how many Americans saw what was widely viewed as a war of choice in Iraq that we launched 2 years later. But over time, Afghanistan became the forgotten war, even though the American role, military, economic, developmental, political, deepened. What started as a war to punish and deter the perpetrators of 9/11 became a campaign to build a new Afghanistan. It had some success, but along the way it attracted great criticism for the depth of American entanglement. Eventually, just as with Nixon and McGovern, the call to end forever wars became a staple of both parties' political platforms. President Obama tried to do it and failed. President Trump tried to do it and failed. Perhaps both failed for the right reasons, that America had a strong interest in staying. But President Biden was committed to try and not fail. And not fail he did. We all know failure has its cost, as we can see in the scenes from Kabul. Sometimes success has its cost too. Many will die with our departure and the collapse of the Afghan government and army. Many will become refugees, searching for the safety of a new home. Anywhere, many more will suffer in country, including almost certainly the half of Afghanistan's population that are women and girls. It is not our responsibility if the Afghans couldn't fight and defend themselves, we are told. Perhaps that is correct in a legal, diplomatic, and even political sense. Morally, of course, the story is more complicated. Today, refugees from Vietnam are among the most integrated, industrious, and successful Americans. Eventually, Afghans are likely to be viewed the same, but getting there was a harrowing path for the Vietnamese, and it will be so for the Afghans too. Whatever one thinks of the decision to end our 20-year war, they, the Afghans, deserve our sympathy and support. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تأثير أفغانستان على السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.